Ever try to like streamline a project, get things moving smoothly, and then you add more people to the mix, thinking it'll speed things up, but instead it's like everything just gets more complicated.
Yeah, totally. Happens all the time.
You're not alone. It turns out this isn't just like a human thing. It's a fundamental principle at play in all sorts of complex systems.
Really?
Yeah. And that's what we're diving into today.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're talking higher order interactions, those connections that happen not just between two things, but three or more.
Okay, so like instead of just A talking to B, you've got A, B, and C all interacting in the mix.
Exactly. And our source material for this deep dive, a fascinating paper from Science Advances, it's going to seriously shift the way you think about stability and control in networks.
Networks, huh? So we're talking like social networks or something else?
Think broader. Brain networks, ecosystems, even the internet itself. Buckle up, because this is going to get pretty mind-bending.
Oh, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
We're talking twisted states, shrinking basins, even a touch of chaos. But don't worry, it's not all theoretical. We'll bring it back down to earth and see how this plays out in the real world.
Okay, good. Because chaos theory always makes my head spin a bit.
I hear ya. But trust me, this is worth wrapping your head around. It's some pretty groundbreaking stuff. So let's start with this idea of twisted states. The researchers used this really cool visual in figure 1A of the paper. Imagine like a circle of fireflies, all blinking, right?
Okay, got it. Blinking fireflies.
But instead of them all being perfectly in sync, there's a kind of twist to the pattern as you go around the circle.
A twist. So like some are blinking faster, some slower.
Not exactly. It's more like the timing of the blinks is off. Imagine as you move around the circle, the blink pattern shifts slightly.
Huh. Okay, I think I get it. It's like a wave going around the circle, but instead of a smooth up and down, it's got this like spiral to it.
Exactly. And you can actually quantify that twist using something called a winding number. Basically tells you how many times that pattern repeats as you go around the circle.
So a higher winding number means a more twisted state. Makes sense.
Exactly. More twists, more complexity. But the article isn't just about describing these twisted states. It's about what happens when you throw higher order interactions into the mix.
Okay, so how do these triadic, or whatever we're calling them, interactions, how do they change things?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The researchers found that when you have those connections between three fireflies instead of just two, the range of stable twisted states the system can handle, it explodes.
Wait, so instead of just a few possible stable patterns, the system suddenly has a whole bunch more just because of these three-way connections?
Exactly, and that's a really big deal.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. But before we go any further, can we rewind a bit? You keep mentioning this research paper. Who are these researchers and what exactly were they studying?
Oh, right, good point. Got ahead of myself there. So the lead researchers on this paper are, so we've got more stable states, more of those twisted patterns, all thanks to these triadic connections.
Right, but there's a catch.
Oh, there's always a catch, isn't there? Okay, I'm listening.
So to understand this trade-off, we got to bring in this idea of basins of attraction. Picture like a bumpy landscape, like hills and valleys.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Those valleys, those represent the stable states we've been talking about. And a wider valley or basin means it's more likely something's going to end up there. It's like if you roll a ball down a hill, it's going to end up in a valley, right? And a wider valley just makes it more likely it's going to land there.
So a bigger basin of attraction means the system is more likely to naturally settle into that particular state. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. Now, here's the thing. Triadic connections, they make for more of those stable valleys, but the valleys themselves, they actually get smaller.
Wait, so more options, but each option is kind of harder to get to. It's like those, what are they called? Like those really secluded beaches you only hear about from like a select few.
Yeah.
They exist, but good luck finding them just wandering around, right?
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And that's the trade-off here. More stability, but less predictability in terms of where the system will actually end up.
So what happens then if those stable states are kind of hidden away? Where does the system end up?
Well, that's when things get really wild. Instead of those nice, stable, twisted states, the system can end up in what's called a chimera state.
Okay, chimera state. Sounds kind of ominous. What exactly are we talking about here?
All right, so remember our fireflies. In a chimera state, some of those fireflies will be blinking in sync, still kind of ordered, but others will be totally out of sync, flashing all randomly. It's this weird mix of order and chaos, all in the same system.
So it's not just that the pattern's a bit off. It's like pockets of order and then just complete randomness all mixed together.
Yeah, exactly. And the article actually has a figure 4, I think, that shows this visually. As those triadic connections get stronger, the system shifts from those twisted states, which still have some overall coherence, to these chimera states, where it's just this jumble of order and disorder.
It's so wild. It's like you try to make things more stable by adding those triadic connections, but then you might end up in this weird in-between state. Kind of like when you add too many people to a group project, thinking more hands will make things easier, but then everyone's doing their own thing and it's just chaos.
That's a perfect analogy. It really highlights a key takeaway from this research. Higher order interactions, they don't just tweak a system's stability a little, they can completely change the types of behavior a system can even have. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see why this is such a big deal. But let's bring this back down to earth a bit. Why does all of this matter for us? What do twisted states, shrinking basins, and chimera states have to do with, our everyday lives?
Well, this research has huge implications for how we think about complex systems, and those are everywhere. Our brains are complex systems, our societies are complex systems, even the ecosystems we rely on, they're all complex systems.
All right, and they all involve tons of interactions, not just between two things, but between many different parts.
Exactly. So take the brain, for example. It's essentially a massive network of neurons, all connected and sending signals to each other.
And those connections are constantly changing and adapting based on our experiences.
Precisely. Now, think about this research in the context of the brain. Could it be that the balance of pairwise and higher order connections in our brains actually shapes how we think, how we feel, how we experience the world?
So, are we saying our brains could be stuck in certain patterns of thought because of these triadic connections?
It's a possibility, right? Like maybe some thought patterns, some ideas, they're perfectly stable, but they're stuck in these tiny basins of attraction, making them really hard to access. It's like they're there, but our brains just don't stumble upon them easily.
Okay, that's kind of a mind-blowing thought. So it's not just about the connections themselves, but the shape of the landscape, those basins that really matter.
Exactly. And this applies to more than just our brains. Think about social systems, the way information spreads, the formation of echo chambers, political polarization, all of that. Could those be influenced by these shrinking basins of attraction?
So, are you saying that it's harder to find common ground to bridge those divides because our social networks are pushing us towards these smaller, more isolated valleys of thought?
It's definitely something to consider, right? This research gives us a whole new way of looking at these complex social dynamics.
Like I said, we talk about echo chambers and filter bubbles, but this is like the underlying topography of those things, the actual landscape that shapes how information flows and how we connect with each other.
Exactly. And understanding that landscape, those basins of attraction, could be crucial if we want to find ways to, build bridges and have more productive conversations.
Okay, so we've gone from fireflies to brains to, the entire fabric of society, big picture stuff. But let's come back to the practical for a second. If even tiny changes can have these huge ripple effects, how do we even begin to, manage or influence these systems? I mean, do we just throw our hands up and say, chaos wins?
Not necessarily. It's not about surrendering to chaos. It's about, really understanding the forces at play. We've got to move past those simple linear cause and effect models instead of just asking what happens if we change this one thing. Well, we need to think about the whole spectrum of possibilities, those basins of attraction that are shaping where the system's headed.
So it's less about predicting the future perfectly and more about understanding the possibilities, maybe finding those leverage points where a small nudge can make a big difference.
Exactly. Think of it like navigating a river. You don't just focus on the current. You need to understand the riverbed, the banks, the things shaping the flow. With complex systems, those basins of attraction, that's our riverbed. If we can map them out, we might find ways to, influence the direction, steer things in a way that benefits us.
Okay, now that's a really cool thought.
Yeah.
It's like we're not just along for the ride. We can actually learn to navigate these systems, even if we can't control every little thing.
Exactly. And that's where things get really exciting. What if we could apply this to real-world problems, social issues, designing resilient ecosystems, even AI development? If we understand those basins of attraction, who knows what we could achieve?
It's a lot to wrap your head around, but this idea that even small changes can have these huge effects, that's kind of empowering, don't you think?
Definitely. It means we all have the potential to make a difference, to shape the systems around us.
So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that we need to pay attention to connections. They're not just like these abstract things. They're the very fabric of our world, from our brains to our societies to the ecosystems we depend on.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about those connections, the more we understand about how the world works and how we can make it better.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been illuminating, to say the least.
My pleasure. Always happy to geek out about complex systems.
And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you next time.